And so just tell me, first of all, your perspective on EPC.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it, for one thing. I've been impressed, hugely impressed, by the quality of the program planning and the quality of the speakers, the women speakers being featured prominently, who have a gift of preaching, really. That's been really impressive. I've enjoyed the music. I've just sent a text to my friend in Australia, Lyle Heiss, who's a muso-theologian, to say, man, there are some new songs being used here that have a future beyond Europe in world church use, I think.
Teehee is our Lyle Heiss.
Yeah.
He is.
Yeah,
he
brilliant.
really is. He's that quality. Yeah.
So I've enjoyed it immensely. And I have really felt privileged to be here and excited to be able to share in the workshops yesterday and to get such positive feedback. So that, I deal with sensitive topics in the workshop, and feedback was really positive. So I'm excited by that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I probably want to begin, about digging deep historically.
Yeah.
Let's just talk generally the excitement of discovering what was to help us know what is.
Yeah.
So you've done research on major Adventist pioneers and have discovered things about them that others have not. Is that the best way to put it for the moment?
Yeah, that's pretty close to what's happening. Previously our history perspective has been kind of to explain and defend the church, to apologize for it in the sense, not to say we're sorry for it, but to set out and to validate the church in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of the church member, validating God's work in the church. And we've relied on minutes of meetings and articles in church papers and reports and transcripts of discussions at General Conference sessions. So in the past it's been a fairly official view of the church and its development. But today there's an enormous amount of other kinds of sources available that give us a perspective on the church, not from an official perspective, but from the church as it lives and grows.
As it really was.
As it really was.
Okay.
Yeah. In one sense, it's a social history. It's an attempt to understand the church and its growth rather than to explain and defend it. It's an attempt to understand how people lived as Adventists. And we've got an ability to explore that in more depth now because we have diaries available. We have a huge body of correspondence that tells us the backstory kind of thing. You can read the official minute, but then later you can read the discussion that went on before the action was taken, or the reaction to the official action, and the arguments and the discussions in the correspondence behind the scenes. And that gives us a much more realistic perspective on Adventist church history.
And as you share history, you're not afraid to share the pain and the experience of some of the people who went through terrible experiences. I always think of A.G. Daniels and his story around 1919 to 1921, and that story about how he felt as the General Conference president, trying to struggle with the forces in the church that were just tearing themselves apart, and he was trying to hold the things together, and then they said goodbye. Yeah,
a very dark period for Daniels. Mind you, he'd been in office for quite a while by then, and he'd thought about leaving himself. But to leave under those circumstances where there was a propaganda campaign out to destroy him and to ruin his reputation, and use that as the basis for removing him from office was really sad and really difficult for him. And that was because the church was struggling with an understanding of the spirit of prophecy, and he had a perspective on Ellen White's work that was much more realistic because he'd worked and lived alongside her and understood how things really happened, not in an idealized, sanitized kind of way. And when he, at the 1919 Bible Conference, tried to have that perception more widely understood, there was a huge reaction to it, and he left office under a cloud that was a really unfortunate situation. But to understand that and the pain that that caused him, and the struggle that the church went through afterwards, we have new perceptions of that now because we have available new sources of information and material.
And so going back to the historians of the 1930s, 40s and 50s in Adventism, and you've said rightly that they sort of give an idealized picture, were they doing spin or were they sincerely trying to tell a story as they saw it? That interests me.
Those historians were working in an age where Adventism was regarded as a cult, and the Christian churches saw it as very odd and very strange. So they were telling the story of Adventism in a way that was an attempt to make it more acceptable to the public. So in some sense it was idealized, but not for bad reasons.
Sure.
And in fact they were trying to use the language of the public in order to explain themselves, which is really what apologetics is about. You know, trying to make yourself understood in the language that people outside the community are using. So Froome and Nichols put a lot of effort into that and were very successful. I guess our ability, our perceptions now is to understand Adventism as a way of understanding them, not to explain so much. And in a sense, I don't know if the word vernacular resonates here at all, but vernacular Adventism is Adventism as it's lived.
Adventism as it's lived, okay.
And experienced.
Yep.
At the vernacular level.
Yep.
Not as Adventism as it's idealized through its magazines or through its preaching or its leaders' modeling of good Adventism.
Right.
This is Adventism as it's experienced at the ground level.
Yes.
Very human and flawed, and all of us with our eccentricities, and yet this community that has this hope and that's looking to the future and clinging on to this hope that Jesus is coming. Understanding that kind of a community, what their neighbours thought of them with these odd beliefs, how those neighbours responded to their relatives,
Sure.
what the community thought of them. We have new perceptions of that now,
Right.
because of this vast volume of new resources that are available. I mean, with Ellen White's writings, previously, we've had her letters, her manuscripts, and that's shaped our understanding, what she wrote to someone and said, and we kind of accepted that as gospel.
Yeah.
We never really took the time to see what the person said back to Ellen White, and then what that person said to their friend about what they'd just received from Ellen White and how they struggled to understand it and how it may need to be modified a little because it wasn't quite correct, mostly, but maybe not in all the details. So we get a feeling for the triangular or the circle around what message was given. And that's given us new insight.
Sorry,
yes, go ahead.
I particularly enjoyed Ellen White and the Presidents.
Oh,
I
you did?
love reading that
Yes.
book. How the presidents navigated the prophet.
Yeah,
Who leads here?
yes.
And that dynamic. And then your subsequent book about the life of Robert H. Pearson and his world. And of course, I've lived through that world.
Yes.
And that's become real. And you can identify with some of the stories that Pearson was involved in, particularly here in Europe.
Yeah.
And it came alive. So certainly what you share about Pearson wasn't idealised. I think we can say that, can't we?
Warts and all.
Warts and all.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is the role of the historian today, right? To give an objective story, a real story. True, you're doing a search for truth, right?
To seek to find out what actually happened, yes. And to understand those people in their personalities, in their temperaments, with their gifts and their leadership hopes and ideals and their practices, but to actually understand them in their own terms so that we can try and see them where they lived in their context. So the book Ostriches and Canaries seeks to do that, yes. And that's the first attempt, I think, that's been made for the 20th century. So I've had that feedback from a number of folk. I was there, I knew that person. Yeah. I didn't know what was happening behind the scenes, but I knew what was happening out front. And it's been very enlightening to a lot of people because of that.
I read it as if I was reading a thriller.
Oh, you did?
It was just like I couldn't put it down.
Well, it's not a novel.
No,
it's
I know
real
that.
history. It's real history.
That's why it was a real thriller.
Yes.
And I mentioned that because, of course, in those stories are all the theological tensions that have gone in the church over the years, whether you're looking back at the 1890s or the 1960s.
Yeah.
And now you're about to create a new story, tell a new story about Edward Heppenstall.
I have been honoured to write a biography of Heppenstall. You know the series that Pacific Press has published on Adventist pioneers?
Indeed, yes.
I don't know how they're going to do it, but they're hoping to expand the title so that we can take in some characters from the 20th century, not just the 19th century. And Heppenstall is one of the first.
And I've got a specific interest in Heppenstall because he comes from England.
He is a Britisher.
He's a Brit.
Good, solid Brit.
And
yes.
of course, I'm stealing your thunder, he's the first Adventist figure, theologian on this side of the Atlantic to emphasize the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ.
And that's true and that's powerful. He comes out of a background where he had a transformative experience around the age of 22, had a Baptist friend who witnessed to him, and grace caught him and transformed him. And from that point on through his life, grace meant so much. And he saw grace as the heart of Adventism, the heart of Adventist hope. So the story of Heppenstall is a story of grace made to work in our doctrines, in our eschatology, and in everyday life. He's a powerful theologian.
Even in the context of the sanctuary and our high priest.
Yes. Yeah, one of his most important books was Our High Priest.
Yeah.
And he really reframed the sanctuary doctrine for us to help us to understand the doctrine of the investigative judgment, not as an investigation of the saints, but as God in judging in favour of the saints. The judgment is good news, not something to be fearful of. So he helped to transform that central doctrine for Adventism, so that judgment now is in fact good news. Yeah.
So he taught at Newbold.
He taught at Newbold before it was Newbold.
Oh yes,
he taught at Stanborough Park.
Oh, is it that far back?
Yes, that's right.
My goodness.
1922, 23, 24.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I know that some of my older pastors, now retired, always talked about sitting in his class. Would they have sat in his class in Berrien Springs or here?
Some would have sat in his class at Berrien Springs, well, at Washington, because he taught
Columbia.
in the seminary.
Okay, right.
Seminary in Washington, and then at the seminary at Andrews.
Okay.
He didn't really want to move to Berrien Springs, but he had to because the seminary moved there. But while he was teaching for the seminary, he would come back to England, I think on 2, maybe 3 occasions.
Okay, that's it.
And conduct extension schools for 6 weeks at Newbold.
Because I've heard my older pastors, the retired pastors, just wax eloquently and said sitting in his class changed their lives.
Isn't that fascinating? He was a charismatic preacher and a charismatic teacher. He'd been a boxer before he became an Adventist. and he was assertive in his teaching,
Yeah.
but friendly assertive.
Yes, yes,
But he had the ability to make you feel that you were the only one in the room when he was preaching, or the only one in class when he was teaching. And he just engaged with people. He'd been a youth director.
Is that right?
Before he became a theology professor. And so there was that warmth of personality that just made him a very engaging and a very charismatic figure.
How was his understanding of grace accepted in the wider Adventist world?
It came with difficulty for some, particularly as it sort of helped to reframe that central doctrine. And because he was anti-perfectionist
Yes.
in his teaching, there was significant pushback on him. But over time, he held his ground and kept the brethren on board with him at the General Conference. He was able to build relationships, and his publications eventually put into print what he'd been teaching for decades in class. And there are those, of course, who think that the book Questions on Doctrine was a departure from historic Adventism, and Heppenstall said no. This emphasis on grace is the heart of Adventism. And so there were those who opposed him from that perspective, those who saw light in the last generation theology and the perfectionism in the last generation, which he believed, because of the nature of man and original sin, not in the traditional sense, but sin as a state rather than what we do. He believed that sinless perfection was a myth, an unattainable dream.
Absolutely.
And that grace was going to be with us right through, and that justification by faith was from conversion right through to the Advent. That was the ground on which we stood.
Amen. Yeah. His lasting contribution to the Adventist story?
His lasting contribution was, I think, this an eschatology that is hopeful and judgment that is good news. Judgment is good news. And that God is going to intervene, and that God will be justified through that judgment as he makes his way clear and vindicates his character. Not through the performance of the saints, but through God's action and intervention.
It's so good to talk with you, Gil.
Lovely.
But I've got to ask one more question.
Sure.
I've got to ask one more question. If you could imagine what Adventism could become, what would it look like?
I think an Adventism of the future will be an Adventism that is inclusive and hopeful and imaginative, and an Adventism that holds on to hope and looks forward positively to a future that God is going to bring, and that we're anxious to share that hope and that good news. That's my view. And I think that was Heppenstall's view as well, a hopeful view of the future.
I can't wait for the book to come across the Atlantic and through the Stammer Press and all our book agencies over here. And it's been printed already?
No, it'll come out next year. I've got one more chapter to write.
Oh, right, okay. So we expect to see it in 2025.
Yeah.
Pacific Press.
Yeah.
I can't wait for it to come out.
You'll enjoy it, I'm sure.
Thank you for talking with us. And if you see this video in 2025, you can obtain this book through lifesourcebookshop.com, which is an agency of the Stammer Press. And I know you will enjoy reading it. Thank you, Gil.
Thank you, David.
We're blessed.
We're blessed too. Thank you.